If you're a renter in BC, you've more than likely felt the squeeze of skyrocketing rents over the last decade. Maybe you've just moved into a new place and you're paying exorbitantly high rents, or maybe you're just worried about losing your current place because it's relatively affordable. Why do rents stay relatively stable during your tenancy, but then massively increase when you have to move out? British Columbia's rent control laws have a massive loophole. What's missing is what's called vacancy control. Broadly speaking, rent controls are laws that limit how much and how often landlords can increase rents. Rent control laws vary widely from place to place. Most BC renters are familiar with annual announcements when the provincial government decides what percentage rents will increase in the following year. That's because the Residential Tenancy Act sets rent controls that apply to all private rental agreements province-wide. However, those limits only apply to continuous tenancies. Vacancy controls are, broadly speaking, the application of rent controls to a housing unit rather than to a tenancy agreement. This limits how much rent can be increased even when a tenant moves out. With rents surging upward and continuing to squeeze working-class renters, it seems like a no-brainer to close this loophole and update the laws so that rents are vacancy controlled, right? 1975 was a period of very high inflation, and in Vancouver, it was also a time of record low vacancy rates. Sound familiar? As rents increased dramatically, the BC NDP Premier Dave Barrett introduced vacancy control to protect renters from price gouging. The measure was so popular, even the next Social Credit Premier Bill Bennett kept vacancy control in place for his first 2 terms, although his government did take measures to weaken it. But opposition from landlords and real estate lobby groups was growing. And while these laws helped to keep housing costs stable and predictable for tenants, for landlords, they represented a major imposition on their ability to set prices and make profits. Finally, in 1983, Bennett's government eliminated BC rent controls altogether. Why did they do this?
I just wanted to shake the hand of the man who got rid of rent control.
Thank you.
For as long as modern rent controls have existed in North America, groups representing real estate and landlord interests have fought them at every level. Lobbyist campaigns in the United States have been so successful that most jurisdictions actually have preemption laws, effectively outlawing rent control. Industry groups also fund research that is used to sway governments and build a myth that rent controls are not only bad for landlords, but they're even harmful for renters. Just like how minimum wages and unions are harmful for workers, right? Let's look at some of the most popular myths around rent control because they have everything to do with why we don't have vacancy control. One argument against rent control suggests that if landlords' incomes are constrained by rent controls, they'll have no money to do proper maintenance on their properties, resulting in substandard living conditions for renters. This is an important consideration in Canada, where roughly half of all private rental apartments were constructed prior to 1972 and are needing significant investments. In order to address concerns about maintenance, most modern rent controls actually contain what are called cost pass-through provisions, which basically means that landlords can still recoup costs incurred from major capital maintenance projects by charging higher rent increases. This is also true in BC, but do rent control laws actually hinder maintenance of properties? Data from Statistics Canada between 2018 and 2021 shows nearly 10% of households reporting housing in need of major structural repairs, while a staggering 67% of households report their basic maintenance needs are not being met by property owners. This data shows that many landlords are not maintaining their properties, even in provinces where no rent controls exist. Meanwhile, average rents across the country have skyrocketed. So where's all that money going? There are many reasons why a landlord might not keep up basic property maintenance, but multiple studies have shown one thing is clear. The attribution of poor maintenance to rent control laws are, quote, theoretically ambiguous. In fact, some studies have even found the opposite to be true. Renters with more security of tenure stay longer, meaning that they're more likely to show an interest in concern, either compelling the landlord to do basic upkeep or they even do some of it themselves. Poor maintenance can lead to higher rates of turnover when tenants decide that they can no longer put up with these living conditions. Without vacancy control in place, this means that the landlord is actually rewarded for their failure to do proper maintenance by increasing rents to market rates. As the rent gap between occupied units and vacant units widens, tenants who can't afford to move might put up with poor maintenance so as not to provoke their landlord and risk eviction. The second and arguably most popular argument against rent control is that it discourages developers from building new rental buildings. This was also the main argument that lobby groups used to convince the provincial government in BC not to implement vacancy control when it was considered in 2018 by the Rental Housing Task Force. Industry groups say that vacancy control would force them to cancel thousands of rental units in the development pipeline, presumably because they wouldn't be able to make enough profit to make the project viable. Instead, most industry groups suggest that the best way to tackle high rents is to focus on increasing the supply of private rentals in the market, ideally with as little rent regulation as possible. Okay, there are two major parts of this argument that demand scrutiny. First, would a whole flood of new rental housing entering the market bring down high rents? Many would argue, yes, this is basic economics 101. Add more supply, demand goes down, prices lower. However, anyone who's actually studied housing economics will tell you that 101 level theory isn't going to cut it. Housing is not a uniform commodity type. Different types of housing serve the needs of different income brackets, and most new private rental housing is built and priced to serve higher income brackets. Okay, sure, but even if they build a lot of luxury housing in my neighborhood, that's fine because all the people who can afford it will move into those new units, and this will free up older existing apartments for lower income renters, right? Well, this should work in theory. This theory has a name. It's known as filtering theory, and decades of research has shown that it doesn't actually lead to more affordability. Kind of like how trickle-down economics doesn't actually work. If you wanted someone moving into your old apartment to pay the same affordable rents you were paying, you'd need a law which keeps those rents low, which is, in fact, vacancy control. Which brings us to the second part of this argument, which is the assertion that vacancy control would single-handedly make or break the bank for developers trying to build rentals. Studies in multiple jurisdictions, including right here in BC, have determined that rent controls are not a major determining factor for whether or not rental housing gets built. Rather, research has repeatedly found that a myriad of other interconnected market conditions play a more important role. Let's look at Canada, where two significant policy changes led to the decline of rental construction in the 1970s and 80s. First were new laws allowing condominiums to be built, meaning developers could reap larger and more immediate profits than rental. The second was when the federal government decided to end two popular programs that gave tax breaks to private rental developments. After the BC Social Credit Government abolished rent control in 1983, rental starts didn't rebound. Similar trends have been observed elsewhere as well. Extensive research examining European cities where rent controls were phased out also found that there was no boom in rental housing construction afterwards. Things only got worse after that. Government disinvestment in private sector rental housing was further exacerbated in the early 1990s when the federal Liberal government decided that they would no longer build any new public housing. Until 1993, the federal government financed and built thousands of affordable social and co-op housing units every year. 30 years later, there is more pressure than ever on the private market to meet the needs of low and middle income people. So while it's true that there is a shortage of affordable rental housing in many parts of BC, the argument that vacancy control specifically would discourage developers from constructing new rentals is, well, hyperbolic. Vacancy control sets limits on rent increases, but it does not, as a single policy, put limits on starting rents on a brand new apartment. And right now, starting market rents are very high, which is a strong incentive to continue building. This is reinforced by existing data on how the multifamily sector is currently outperforming all others. But what about those smaller mom-and-pop landlords who are just renting out their basement to offset their mortgage costs?
They're all property property owners, and they're all riled up over rent controls.
Lobbyists like to put mom-and-pop landlords front and center in the debate over rent controls. But as Canada's housing market becomes increasingly financialized, the definition of what we even call a small landlord matters. Statistics Canada data shows us that just 5% of homeowners with one property were renting out part of their home. This means that the vast majority of landlords actually own multiple properties. Meanwhile, large corporate landlords have increasingly become central players. Data from 2020 shows that 20% of rental apartments are owned by one of Canada's largest corporate landlords. These 25 companies own more than 340,000 apartments. It's also worth noting that institutional investor landlords have a demonstrated preference for provincial jurisdictions with limited rent controls, weak tenant protections, and loopholes for above-guideline increases. This is because their goal is to maximize the amount of rent that they can charge for each unit they own. A measure like vacancy control in BC would be an important regulation to limit the power of large corporate landlords who dominate the market and primarily drive skyrocketing rents.
I buy a few little pieces of income property for my old age, and what happens? I'm taxed to death.
Why don't you give your houses away to your tenants and let them worry about paying the taxes?
Yeah.
The main arguments against vacancy control are based on economic dogmas that, when examined, don't tell the full story of how the housing market actually works in the real world. The private housing market in BC and Canada is, in some aspects, already highly regulated and remains highly profitable. But when it comes to the viability of private rental housing as a business, rent caps are not as significant of an economic lever as developers and landlords want us to think they are. 1/3 of all households in British Columbia are renters. That's over 1 million. And of those, 1 in 5 households are severely rent burdened, paying more than half of their income on rent. Depending on how it's implemented, vacancy control could mean more moderate and predictable increases for renters, as well as a preservation of affordable units and an end to profit-motivated evictions. But we shouldn't consider vacancy control a silver bullet on its own. The power that real estate lobbyists and economists wield over our rental housing and over housing policy stems from the fact that the vast majority of housing is privately owned and controlled. In the long term, we need to build a lot more publicly owned and permanently affordable housing that functions to meet our needs as homes first and foremost, without being a vehicle for someone else's profit. We'll talk about that in our next video on public housing. Thanks for watching.